About me, I am a 30-year-old individual who has been working in a senior position at a bank for the last 5 years. I earn an above-average salary and have managed to acquire my own apartment in the city center. I also own a good car, all of which I obtained before getting married. My family has always been complete, consisting of my father, mother, and younger sister. My parents had a strong relationship for 30 years, with my father serving as a role model for my mother and vice versa. They always made important decisions together, and our home was free from any conflicts or scandals. My grandparents were also actively involved in our upbringing, creating a friendly and open environment that extended to cousins and sisters. Even to this day, we all maintain strong social connections. About her, she is 23 years old and has never held a job. Apart from a fur coat gifted by her ex-partner, she does not possess any significant personal belongings. She is the youngest child in her family. Unfortunately, her mother passed away when she was 16, and her father remarried at the age of 65 and now lives with his new wife. Her older sister, age 45, has never been married and tends to date much younger men. She has raised a son on her own, who has never met his father and seems disinterested in doing so. Her brother, around 37 years old, is married with 2 children, but does not reside with his wife and kids. Their family experiences constant conflicts. Another sister, 26 years old, initially got married but later initiated a divorce. She restricts her ex-husband's access to their child and has since converted to Islam. She now lives in another city with an Arab from Yemen, dressing in accordance with her faith. She holds resentment towards most of her relatives, except her father. As a result, her ex-husband no longer has contact with their child. We randomly crossed paths on the internet, which led to us exchanging messages. Eventually, I decided to invite her to meet in person. Reflecting back, I believe it was the day before my 28th birthday. Instantly, I was captivated by her, mainly because of her appearance. Everything about her seemed perfect, particularly her figure. At that time, I was already fully prepared to settle down and start a family, so I organized these meetings with the hope of finding a future wife. However, she treated these dates like a sport, almost like hunting. She enjoyed being surrounded by many men, only to discard them later and revel in her own self-importance. To save time, I'll skip over the details of our relationship at this stage, but I managed to win her over after 6 months of persistence. Interestingly, whenever I decided to distance myself from her, she would always find a way to reach out and remind me of her existence. According to her, the most important thing is to give hope, as she played this foolish game that held us together with a thin yet unmistakable thread from the beginning to the end. After going on numerous dates, enjoying movies and cafe outings, and engaging in delightful phone conversations, our relationship progressed to the point where she started staying at my house for a few days. During this time, she had a job that required her to travel for an hour from her home. Recognizing the inconvenience, I proposed that she move in with me, offering my home as her own. I emphasized that living together would be practical since it was closer to her workplace, and I could provide transportation in the mornings. However, she initially declined, expressing concerns about cohabitation being improper and fearing her father's disapproval if he were to find out. Consequently, she kept our relationship a secret for 6 months, occasionally visiting me without my family's knowledge. I also hesitated to introduce her to my parents, still trying to grasp the situation and feeling unsure about the appropriate timing to make introductions. After our first kiss, a series of dramatic events unfolded. The very next day, she dropped a bombshell, claiming she was moving to another city in search of a better life. I was baffled. We had just begun our relationship and now she wanted to leave me. As it turned out, her plans to relocate were nothing more than a fleeting idea. Then came another revelation. She complained that I didn't shower her with enough compliments or adoration. According to her, she needed constant attention from men, and I wasn't meeting that expectation. I was taken aback by her statement as it didn't align with the reality of our relationship. To make matters even more perplexing, during one of our weekend getaways in the first month of dating, she abruptly got out of bed and declared that she wanted nothing to do with me and would never return. There was no apparent reason behind this outburst. Once again, I was left stunned, wondering what I had done wrong. Later on, she revealed that my failure to say, "I love you," was the cause of her sudden outburst. In an attempt to reconcile, I visited her in the evening, expressing my special feelings for her through words, gifts, and affectionate gestures. Thankfully, this seemed to calm her down, and our relationship was back on track. A week later, the same drama unfolds once again. She wakes up in the morning, discontented, and informs me with unwarranted aggression that she intends to leave me. Frustrated, I tried to engage in a conversation later that evening to understand the root of her dissatisfaction and discuss any underlying issues. However, she responded with silence, only muttering that I consistently fail to meet her expectations. Reluctantly, I drove her back to her place and suggested that if we couldn't get along, it would be best not to continue torturing each other. As I left her doorstep, my phone rang, and to my astonishment, it was her. On the other end, I heard words of hatred and accusations, stating that she never wanted to see me again. I was taken aback by such an unexpected outburst, as I had been in relationships in the past, but had never experienced anything like this before. Initially, I felt a sense of relief, thinking that it was finally over. However, the story didn't end there. That same evening, she called again and again, persistently trying to reach me. After numerous attempts, I decided to answer, only to hear her proclaiming her love for me, admitting her mistakes, and pleading for my forgiveness. I found this flip-flopping behavior puzzling and questioned the authenticity of her words. I expressed my confusion and wariness over her sudden mood swings, explaining that I had been in relationships before and had encountered various challenges, but this was a completely new experience. We didn't communicate for a week following that incident, but then she came back into my life, claiming that she had reconsidered everything and promised that such incidents would not repeat. Being kind-hearted and naive, I chose to believe her. One day, I decided to visit her apartment for the first time. As I drove away, my phone suddenly rang, and it was my mom calling to check up on me and have a conversation. After the call, a wave of frustration hit me immediately. Why does she call me so often? As a grown man, I shouldn't be in constant communication with her. Ideally, it should be limited to once a week, or even less. I was taken aback by these thoughts and expressed to her that it wasn't fair. I wasn't going to restrict communication with my own mother just to cater to her unreasonable demands. Unfortunately, the situation only worsened. She went on to call me a mama's boy and criticized me for maintaining such close ties with my parents, even at 28 years old. According to her, I needed to be more independent and move out of my father's empty apartment. She believed that this was the way things should be and accused me of being overly attached to my mother. I tried explaining to her repeatedly that this wasn't the case. I had everything I needed for my own family, a stable job, a good social standing, and I considered myself a mature individual. But my words fell on deaf ears. In a moment of calm, when everything seemed to be going well, and there was a sense of stability, I made a foolish decision. I proposed to her, even giving her an engagement ring in advance. Looking back, I realized how irrational I was. Please don't judge me too harshly. I was deeply in love at that time, and it clouded my judgment completely. I dove headfirst into the relationship, as if in a state of delusion. On top of everything else, I discounted the fact that she was only 21 years old. After proposing to her, I had high hopes for our future. Finally, she had moved in with me permanently, and I believed that we could build a happy family together. I felt pity for her, having lost her mother at such a young age and feeling neglected by her own family. I wanted to show her a different kind of life, filled with love and care. However, it soon became apparent that she carried deep emotional scars from her past. As we started living together, I noticed that the situation didn't improve. She became increasingly jealous of my mother, often causing unnecessary arguments. In response, I began to limit my communication with my mother whenever my wife was around. I would only speak to her when it was absolutely necessary, whether it was at work or somewhere else. My wife even started checking my phone, going through my call logs, and demanding printouts from my cell phone carrier to monitor who I was talking to. She wasn't pleased when my father called either. This resulted in frequent arguments and disagreements. Visiting my parents' house became a highly undesirable activity for her. She would often ask me to take her back home, and then demand that I pick her up later, only to forgive me for causing her distress. This cycle of leaving and returning happened countless times. Sometimes she would even pack up her things and threaten to leave overnight. Later, she would complain that I didn't show enough concern or call to check up on her after she had gone back to her home. It was clear that our relationship was becoming strained, with constant conflicts arising from her insecurities and fears. One day, she confided in me that she had told her father about our living arrangements. Unfortunately, her father expressed concern over our age difference and my marital status, believing something may be wrong with me for not being married by the age of 28. I was extremely angry and reacted impulsively, declaring that we were breaking up and that I had no intentions of seeing her again. I couldn't bear to listen to any more of this nonsensical judgment. Her behavior had been inconsistent, exhibiting sudden mood swings and irrational reactions over insignificant matters. For an entire week, I chose to ignore her calls and messages, while she desperately begged for forgiveness. She claimed I had offered her my hand and heart, accusing me of wrongdoing, betrayal, and humiliation in front of her relatives. Firmly, I expressed my exhaustion and desire for a healthy relationship, not one plagued by such erratic behavior resembling schizophrenia. In response, she attributed her actions to hormones and claimed she needed to address her emotional well-being due to her unhappiness and limited means. Despite her pleas, I remained unforgiving, making it clear that our relationship was over, and I would not sacrifice myself for the sake of such absurdity. A week later, I met with my friends at the club to discuss our shared passion for music, as I have been playing guitar for 15 years. Unexpectedly, she appeared at our performance, tearfully asking for forgiveness and declaring that I was the best and that she loved me. In a state of euphoria, influenced by alcohol, I embraced her, and we went home together, satisfying our desires and temporarily reconciling. Things seemed to improve, and we managed to live together in a somewhat amicable manner. It is worth noting that she excels as a homemaker, keeping the apartment tidy, displaying excellent cooking skills, and paying attention to my appearance. She is also frugal with finances. In December 2013, we decided to apply to the registry office to get married. I had the opportunity to meet her father and stepmother, and I introduced her to my parents as well. We excitedly shared the news of our upcoming marriage with them. Putting my usual perfectionism to work, I meticulously planned and prepared for the wedding, spending a considerable amount of money and even arranging a trip to the Dominican Republic. The wedding itself went smoothly, and the following day we embarked on our much-anticipated trip. While en route, we had a minor disagreement, but it was nothing serious. Upon reaching the hotel, however, I noticed that her mood was slightly off as she expressed dissatisfaction with certain aspects such as the room and the restaurant. Thankfully, her mood improved over time, and everything seemed to be going well. Unfortunately, things took a turn for the worse when I innocently took a photograph of her. Due to her obsession with her appearance, she became furious upon seeing the photo, believing that I had taken an unflattering picture of her. In a fit of anger, she threw her wedding ring across the room, not even considering its value. This action shocked and upset me, prompting me to express my disappointment and explain how disrespectful and hurtful her reaction was. I desperately tried to make her understand the sacredness and significance of the ring. In the midst of our heated argument, she began shouting, demanding a divorce, claiming that I constantly annoy her. The situation escalated, attracting the attention of other vacationers in nearby rooms who were compelled to knock on our door, resulting in an embarrassing and shameful public scene. Despite the turmoil, we managed to salvage the remainder of our vacation and returned home safely. Once back home, we had to confront the issues that had surfaced during our trip and work through them together. When I returned home, I made the decision to support my wife financially so that she could focus on taking care of the household chores and leave her stressful job, as she desired. Looking back, I realize how foolish I was. We lived a stable life until May 2014, as if experiencing a period of remission. I would go to work while she stayed at home, and everything seemed fine at last. However, there was always an underlying resentment towards my parents. Whenever my father would call, I would wonder what he wanted, and my mother's calls became annoying. We believed that our family was separate from theirs, and we didn't need their interference or assistance. In truth, my parents had never asked me for anything. But one day my sister needed a camera and I offered to lend it to her. This seemingly ordinary situation turned into a huge scandal. My wife accused my parents of disrupting our peaceful life, of constantly meddling and asking for things, and even of me secretly discussing her with my mother. However, the reality was that my parents had no idea what was happening in my family life. I always tried to present my wife in the best light and maintain the illusion of a perfect family. Anyways, she once again threw her ring, packed her bags, and threatened to divorce me. I told her that if she wanted a divorce, I would accept it, and she left for her father's house with her belongings. I found myself alone at home, contemplating the best way to inform my family about the impending divorce. They had no clue about the difficulties I was facing, as it had only been 4 months since our wedding. As evening approached, the situation took a turn. My wife called and apologized, explaining that her father had advised her against leaving me. She returned home with her bags. In late April to early May, I unexpectedly lost my job due to circumstances beyond my control. Unfortunately, our organization went bankrupt during this time, coinciding with the intensive cleanup of the banking system. Although I had enough savings to comfortably support myself for another 5 to 6 months, I remained calm and started contemplating our next steps, realizing that finding a new job wouldn't be easy. Taking action, I registered with the Employment Service and received my full salary for 4 months as mandated by the law. I stayed at home during this period, trying to make the most of the situation. One day during a casual meeting, my mother mentioned that if my wife wasn't working, she could also register with the Employment Service and receive some additional financial help without burdening the state. This suggestion took me by surprise and I pondered its feasibility. However, when I shared this idea with my wife, things took an unexpected turn. She became defensive and lashed out at both me and my mother, claiming that she didn't need any advice and knew how to manage her own life. Despite the misunderstanding, we decided to make the most of our summer break. With sufficient funds, we took vacations to the countryside and various other destinations. I introduced my wife to the benefits of physical exercise and encouraged her to join me at the gym and pool, as I've always been passionate about sports. However, during one of her gym sessions, she had a rather unpleasant encounter with a coach who simply wanted to clarify whether we needed to change into specialized shoes. This innocent inquiry infuriated her, causing her to overreact and storm out of the training session. Consequently, she refused to go back, and our active lifestyle abruptly came to a halt. It is unfortunate that this incident had such a negative impact on our routines and activities. After receiving a great job offer, I saw it as a lifeline and eagerly seized the opportunity. To prepare for the interview and gather the necessary documents, I kindly asked my partner for some uninterrupted time. Unfortunately, without any apparent reason, another argument erupted, and as usual, my mother and sister were blamed. My wife began criticizing me, saying she would find someone better who would pay more attention to her, and she labeled me a mama's boy. I chose to ignore her remarks as they were unimportant to me, but she became more aggressive, threatening to pour water on my laptop and guitar. I paid no attention to her countdown, but she went ahead and poured water on my guitar. I was overcome with anger and reached a breaking point, forcefully removing her from the apartment while yelling in a way that was uncharacteristic for me. She attempted to make a phone call to someone and insulted my mother with hurtful words. In shock, I snatched the phone from her hand and threw it to the ground. I then proceeded to gather her belongings and escorted her out of the apartment. It became clear to me that I needed to put a stop to these escalating conflicts. The stress from both the personal issues and work difficulties was taking a toll on my mental and physical health. She starts complaining about me to her father, describing me as a tyrant who kicked her out of our home, claiming that I treated her in a way that real men shouldn't, and even accusing me of physically assaulting her. She then adds that she came crawling back to me, apologized, and admitted her guilt for her rude behavior. This scenario was repeated countless times. Meanwhile, I was preoccupied with the possibility of getting a new job, and my hopes were high. However, things took an unexpected turn when we discovered that she was pregnant. This news brought me great joy, especially since the doctors had told us that she had very little chance of getting pregnant due to infertility. Our newfound sense of purpose in life was a dream come true, and the fact that we were expecting a boy made the event even more special. Despite all the challenges we faced in our relationship, she too seemed happy about the pregnancy. Unfortunately, her pregnancy went far from smoothly. For the first 3 months, she was plagued by severe morning sickness, leaving no room for additional stress. I did my best to support and help her through this difficult stage. However, when her pregnancy reached 4 months, she started bleeding and was in danger of miscarriage. In a panic, I personally took her to the hospital as the ambulance did not arrive in time. I begged the doctors to provide urgent care, assuring them that I would bear all the expenses. I visited her every day during her 2-week stay in the hospital, tirelessly running after the doctors and doing everything I could for her well-being. She couldn't help but complain about the unclean hospital environment and lack of proper care. The doctors explained that there was no specific treatment for her case and that it was a matter of natural selection. They assured us that they were doing everything in their power. My mother, upon learning of the situation, tried to express support by calling her. However, my wife was unhappy with the way she was spoken to during the conversation, although I saw nothing wrong with it. As a result, she began to ignore subsequent calls from my mother, refusing to answer them or return the call. She later stated that my mother had not helped her in any way, but I could not understand how she expected my mother to help her in such circumstances. Eventually, my wife was discharged from the hospital after 2 weeks. The doctors informed us that, thankfully, the chances of saving the baby were not as slim as first thought. I have disliked the hospital she was in since I was a child. It never made me feel comfortable or at ease, especially when I went through the ICU. The atmosphere there seemed to radiate negative energy, and it always made me fear for her well-being. In December 2014, as the new year approached, I was optimistic and things were going well at my new job. My wife was going for an ultrasound and the doctors confirmed that the baby was healthy. We were all excited and looking forward to the long weekend. However, on January 4, during the holidays, I received a call from my mother informing me that my father was not feeling well. When I talked to my dad, he assured me that it was just a pinched nerve in his back and that he was feeling better after some rest. My dad and I had always been close, loving music and spending time together in the garage discussing cars. The next morning, January 5, my mom called me again to let me know that my dad had been admitted to the hospital. His condition was serious, and she asked me to help pack his things and take her to the hospital. There was also an urgent need to buy medicine. I hurriedly packed my belongings. However, when my wife offered to come with me, I got agitated and insisted that she stay at home because of the cold weather. She reacted violently, expressing her displeasure and demanding that I enlist my sister to help. Despite her outburst, I ignored her and focused on the task at hand. I arrived at the hospital, picked up my mom, and retrieved my dad's belongings. Later, my mom informed me that my dad had been diagnosed with a duodenal ulcer. Although I was relieved to learn that the condition was treatable and explained his symptoms, my wife found the diagnosis amusing and downplayed my initial fears by comparing it to something harmless like chickenpox. On the morning of January 7, my mother called me and asked me to buy a medicine that the doctors had prescribed. I immediately got ready and started calling pharmacies. Unfortunately, most of them were closed, except for one that was on duty. I contacted them and confirmed that they had the medication I needed. I asked them to hold it for me while I hurriedly made my way to the parking lot to pick up my car. My wife, with a disapproving look on her face, expressed her displeasure with my mother. She called again and suggested that my younger sister should go for the medication. This angered me because I was perfectly capable of doing it quickly on my own. I tried to explain to my wife that my father was in the ICU and his condition could be serious. However, she insisted that we go shopping together. At that moment, I felt a surge of anger towards her, but reminded myself to stay calm because she was pregnant. There was no time for heated arguments. I drove to the hospital, delivered the medicine, and talked to the doctor. They confirmed that my father had indeed suffered a heart attack, but assured me that his condition was stable. My nerves were on edge and I couldn't shake off the overpowering anxiety. My wife called me, screaming that I was insensitive for leaving her alone, and demanded that I come home urgently with the money, threatening to leave me. I begged her to stay home, disregarding the freezing weather outside. I couldn't understand why she cared so little about my father's fate. Her answer shocked me. He is a stranger to me. I don't know him, he means nothing to me. So yes, I'm being a pig. I really don't care. Give me the money and I'll leave. I couldn't bring myself to argue or berate her. My mind was occupied with other thoughts, and her pregnant weight was a constant reminder to hold back. I just threw the money on the table and lay down on the bed. She left for her father's house, leaving me alone at home. My phone was constantly buzzing with tense conversations. Later that evening, my wife returned, seemingly in a better mood, and enjoyed her time visiting. I was mentally exhausted and couldn't find the energy to talk or do anything. Confused by my sadness, she asked, "Why are you so depressed?" I answered her in a defeated tone. "Don't you understand?" She countered. "You have your own family now, your parents won't be around forever." I said nothing more and tried my best to distract myself from my overwhelming emotions. On January 9, I found myself in a persistent bad mood. To distract myself, I tried to focus on playing my guitar. The reason for my sadness was unclear, and I didn't have the desire to understand it at the time. The next day, on January 10, I received a call from my mother. Her voice trembled as she delivered the devastating news that my father had passed away. It felt as if the world was collapsing right before my eyes. My wife shed a tear, though I couldn't decipher whether it was genuine or not. At that moment, it didn't really matter. Following the news, I found myself dealing with various funeral arrangements, interacting with funeral agents who seemed less than empathetic. The experience was a series of exhausting trips to the morgue, compounded by the dismal weather. Relatives came to offer their support, and my mother was grief-stricken. Personally, I was in a state of shock. but my family did their best to be there for me. On January 13, we laid my father to rest. The horrific images of that day are etched into my memory and will likely never fade away. Due to the taxing nature of the situation, I decided against taking my wife to the funeral. I didn't want the emotional strain to negatively affect her, especially considering she was experiencing constant stomach pain. Throughout the whole ordeal, my wife seemed indifferent to the situation. She continually emphasized that my focus should be on taking care of the living, specifically her, rather than the deceased. She went as far as to say that my father no longer mattered. The morning before the funeral, I administered a magnesium shot to alleviate her stomach pain. However, she called me as I was picking up my father's remains to complain about a new pain in her buttocks, blaming the shot I had given her. At that point, I had become emotionally detached and no longer cared. The day after the funeral, my wife spoke to my mother on the phone and expressed her dissatisfaction with how she felt taken advantage of. I had been helping my mother with the necessary paperwork following my father's passing. My wife demanded that I leave my mother's side immediately. She then called me and threatened to withhold access to our home unless I returned within 15 minutes. She claimed that she needed some pills urgently. Furious, I rushed home and found myself unable to open the door. Eventually, she allowed me in, but there was no warmth or words of comfort. Instead, she coldly mentioned that she was heading to the pharmacy, leaving me feeling utterly unsupported. In that moment, she uttered words that struck a nerve. She said, "Now do you know how I felt in the past? Do you like it?" Overwhelmed and exhausted, I physically collapsed onto the floor, remaining in that position for a while. Following these incidents, I found myself sinking into a state of depression. Attempting to address it, I took up a gym routine, but unfortunately, it proved ineffective in alleviating my struggles. In an attempt to find solace elsewhere, I resorted to consuming alcohol in moderation during the evenings. However, this temporary relief only lasted for a period of approximately 3 months, as the alcohol failed to provide substantial assistance. Instead of receiving the elementary support and understanding one would expect from a spouse, my wife responded with remarks such as, "Look, he's in mourning," or "Why are you so sad? What has happened?" This was the dynamic that persisted between us until March 2015. To provide myself with a distraction and find solace, I took up a new hobby of building aircraft models after work. During this time, I neglected my interest in music, which weighed heavily on my spirit. It was incredibly disheartening to see my morals and values disregarded. Unfortunately, my father passed away at the young age of 53, leaving me feeling trapped in a difficult situation that I couldn't easily escape. It felt like being stuck in a deepening swamp. In March of this year, my wife and I found ourselves in another heated argument. The primary issue was my lack of attention towards her, coupled with her perception that I had become disinterested in her. She accused me of treating her like a neighbor and threatened to leave, leaving me as nothing more than a weekend father. Adding to the tension, she refused to consider my preferred name choices for our baby, asserting that she alone would make that decision. She even questioned where my money was going, suspecting that I was secretly giving it to my mother. The argument dragged on for 3 days, with my wife resorting to destructive behavior. She tore my clothes, poured water on my laptop, and threw my guitars out of the window. As if that wasn't enough, she took a glass of water and began pouring it on the music center my father had given me years ago. Out of sheer emotion, I intervened, grabbing the glass to prevent further damage. In the heat of the moment, I reacted angrily, throwing a plate of borscht she had prepared into the toilet, stating how repulsed I was by her cooking. It was unlike me to act this way, especially only a year after our wedding. Things continued to escalate as my wife started kicking and destroying things around the apartment. She even smashed the aircraft model I had spent weeks assembling. The situation reached a climax with her tearing our wedding photos and throwing my wedding ring around the apartment. Eventually, I decided to seek refuge at my mother and sister's place. I explained the difficult circumstances we had been enduring, feeling embarrassed but unable to hide it any longer. The only consolation was that my father never witnessed these events, as he would not have tolerated such behavior. The next day, my wife started sending me accusatory text messages, insulting my mother and demanding that I live with her. I decided not to respond, but towards evening the phone calls started. She claimed that I had abandoned her during her pregnancy and threatened to reveal her true thoughts to my mother, insinuating that it would make her speechless. These words are imprinted in my memory, and I quote them verbatim. She even went so far as to accuse my mother of reducing my father to the grave and expressed her desire to do the same to me. Eventually, my wife reluctantly apologized. Her anger was evident in her tense tone, but she did apologize, admitting her guilt. The peace and tranquility lasted only a month until our son was born. The labor went quickly, and our son was born healthy. One would assume it was a time of happiness and joy. However, the last 9 months have been a tumultuous journey. I took it upon myself to organize everything for the baby: cribs, strollers, clothes, and other necessities, while my wife took care of the hospital costs and midwife fees. To ease our burden, my mom even loaned us my late father's car, which resulted in me selling my own. It seemed we had everything we needed for a happy life. But alas, that was not the case. While my wife was in the hospital and I was busy with work, my mother arrived to clean up our apartment and get everything ready for our discharge. She even brought in new furniture and thoroughly cleaned every corner. She devoted 2 days to this and also prepared food for us. During this time, my wife called me and asked me what I was doing. I answered honestly that my mom was here to help and took care of everything. Her reply, recounted verbatim, read, "Tell her to leave our house and don't let her touch my pots and pans." My mother sensed something was wrong, but she couldn't hear the words my wife was saying to me. In an attempt to maintain a semblance of celebration, I decided to open a bottle of champagne that I had been saving since our wedding day, specifically for the birth of the baby. My mom and I each had a glass, enjoying a moment of happiness before her goodbye. However, afterward, a distinct feeling of sadness came over me again. Only my mom and sister came to pick me up from the hospital after I was discharged. I don't know why no one around her came. They just didn't seem to care. However, my wife explained that according to her beliefs, the baby should not be shown to anyone until 40 days had passed. Finally, we arrived home. The baby is a real blessing, sleeping peacefully and hardly crying at all. However, my wife has started to worry because she feels exhausted and is experiencing postpartum depression. It irritates her that I am able to sleep while she has a hard time doing so. As for our son's name, I made the decision and she had to accept it, even though she was clearly not happy about it. The recent scandal erupted when my mother was denied entry to my apartment. My wife needed to visit the doctor, but since I couldn't leave work, I suggested that my mother could come and help, especially since she hadn't seen her grandson yet. However, my wife responded angrily, saying, "Are you stupid? I already told you that your mother is not welcome here. She can never come over, not even with my permission." I was puzzled by her reaction and tried explaining that my mother is part of our family and deserves respect, even if my wife doesn't feel love towards her. Unfortunately, she refused to engage in dialogue or listen to any reasoning. This discontent on her part persisted for 4 days. On Friday, after a tiring day at work, I returned home to hear my wife say, "Start disassembling the crib. My son and I are leaving you." I responded by telling her that if she was unhappy, she could leave, but she couldn't take our 2-week-old baby with her. I emphasized that our child was not a possession to be moved around like bags of belongings. In frustration, I threatened to call an ambulance and have her sedated if she didn't calm down. In response, she insulted me, using vulgar language and threatening violence against me. I couldn't bear it any longer, and I impulsively slapped her. This only enraged her further, and she began physically attacking me, hitting and kicking while I desperately recorded the incident for evidence. Her assault caused scratches on my arms and a cut on the bridge of my nose. Meanwhile, she started haphazardly packing her belongings, claiming she was leaving me and attempting to take the baby with her. I positioned myself in front of the baby to prevent her from doing so. Thankfully, the baby remained peacefully asleep throughout the chaos. In tears, she called her sister, recounting a distorted version of events, falsely alleging that I had kicked her out and neglected her basic needs. Then her sister's son, a 23-year-old who spoke inappropriately and aggressively, called me to lecture me on how to behave as a man and demanded that I leave. He even sent threatening messages filled with offensive language. Please note that this rewrite doesn't encourage or support any form of violence or aggression. It focuses on providing a more neutral and factual description of the events. Shortly after, my wife's father and my mother arrived. I called them over to witness the inappropriate behavior of my wife, hoping to dispel any misunderstandings others may have had. The way she spoke made it sound like a far-fetched fantasy. I also made it clear that I wanted to terminate her parental rights. Unfortunately, her father turned out to be just as problematic. He was extremely displeased with being involved, and my mother had to endure a lot of humiliation from my wife. In the end, I felt like a helpless mama's boy, surrounded by negativity and longing for a real man in my wife's eyes. She even mentioned seeking legal help to prevent the loss of parental rights. It feels like dark clouds have returned to our home and our conversations are purely business related. I've come to realize that I can't continue to live like this. It's unbearable. I haven't been able to take care of my dental health because of my high blood pressure, and it's taking a toll on me mentally and physically. However, my little baby son, who resembles me so much, gives me immense love. He's an innocent angel, but I know it's wrong to raise him in such a toxic environment. I can't forgive this situation anymore. I've even had thoughts of suffocating my wife with a pillow at night, but I'm lost, unsure of what to do. Divorce is the obvious solution, but legally I can't pursue it until a year after the birth of our child, and detaching myself from this nightmare won't be easy. Termination of her parental rights is a challenging process, as previous cases have shown. She loves our child and won't give him up easily. She's even willing to resort to drastic measures, claiming she would commit a crime to hold on to him. On the other hand, I worry about who she would raise him to be. Will he turn out like her older sister's son, a troubled individual? She has no interests, spending her days watching mindless television shows and lacking any ambition or curiosity. I realize that I am ultimately responsible for allowing her to take advantage of me, and I realize that I should have addressed this problem earlier. I have tried different approaches, both positive and negative, but unfortunately the result has always been temporary improvement followed by relapse. My previous attempts to distance myself from her have not been successful, especially now that we have a child together. She skillfully manipulates the situation by using our child to elicit pity. As a man, it is difficult for me to find common ground with her, and I am constantly on the lookout for other potential partners. This situation has turned my life into a nightmare.